All right, again, I'm Dr. Rowling. Welcome to our presentation today here at Dental CE Academy. This course is Electronic Cigarettes, the Culture of Vaping. This is a course that I've presented since 2013. And background about me, I'm a public health dentist here in Phoenix, Arizona. I was the chief for the Office of Oral Health here for Maricopa County's Public Health Department. It's the third largest in the US, and I oversaw the tobacco cessation program here. So I'm very familiar with vaping, and I'll be talking about some of the experiences in terms of programmatic experiences as well. Feel free to ask me questions by typing in the chat area. And be sure to review the instructions that we have for you in your course folder. My conflict of interest and financial disclosure is there for you. This course is not sponsored. There is our agenda for the live presentation for those of you who are watching it as a recording. Of course, this is not your agenda. But if you do need assistance with CE credit, there's a link there for you also. Be sure to submit that, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Before I move forward, I just want to let you know I do have COVID. I've had it for a week. I was hoping to be over it, but apparently I am not. So if my voice cuts in and out, just let me know by typing in the chat area. I have a little ginger ale, a little water here to try to keep my voice clear, and we're doing the best we can. So all the objectives are for you in the handout. Electronic cigarettes were developed in and around 2003, and they were introduced into the US market between 2006 and 2007. And of course, we know they've quickly grown in popularity as a nicotine source for many of our patients. And they're considered relatively new products. They're designed to simulate smoking a traditional tobacco cigarette by what? By heating a nicotine-containing solution. It includes flavorings and a delivering system such as propylene glycol or vegetable glycerin that produces an aerosol, not really a vapor, and then it's inhaled by the user. So this is one of those early models, if you will, and these are still on the market, and they look like the real deal, right? They had really the same diameter, the same feel in the user's hand, the LED lit ash at the end, the filter tip. What do we know now about electronic cigarettes? Well, we certainly know more than we did 10 years ago when I started presenting this course. But the short and long-term effects of e-cigarette use remain unclear. We know their use is definitely increasing. We do know about the acute effects of e-cigarettes on heart rate, blood pressure, airway resistance. And we know that in a subset of users, early on especially, there was improved cessation. However, tobacco use, there are studies that reported decreased cessation in dual users who are now using both regular and electronic cigarettes. The question, electronic cigarettes, we know as a disruptive technology, but will they end traditional smoking? And public health experts were concerned and are concerned that e-cigarette use could renormalize smoking, delay or prevent cessation attempts, promote youth use, and draw former smokers back into their nicotine addiction. We also know that big tobacco has really jumped in here. They've bought up a lot of the smaller companies, and they've branded their own brands. Views would be one of those. So here was an early e-cigarette starter package that could actually be sent in the mail or purchased in a local shop, etc. And this is a pre-filled cartridge style. So those black cartridges that represent really the filter of this device, it screws onto the housing, and it's pre-filled with the e-liquid. Notice the USB charger. And you can pick if you'd rather have a chrome day or a plaid day, and of course, tobacco or menthol flavoring. All right, electronic nicotine delivery systems is what we're actually talking about today, which electronic cigarettes happens to be the most popular of the ends. And you can see these devices come in all shapes and sizes. So again, electronic cigarettes, the most common type of electronic nicotine delivery system. And other types of ends would include e-cigars, e-pipes, e-hookahs, and early on, no current regulation of those devices. So what happened when these devices hit the shores of the US, the FDA had not studied these devices. As we'll see, we did not know what the health risks were to the public. We do know electronic cigarettes represent a booming industry estimated at billions of dollars. It was 2.5 billion in 2014. Now, the first e-cigarette patented was in 1965, a gentleman by the name of Herbert A. Gilbert. And it's the device these days really isn't too far from that device. Why didn't it become popular? Well, at that time in 1965, nearly 50% of the US population smoked tobacco, believe it or not. 1 in every 2 adults in the United States smoked tobacco. So the health risks were not yet known in 1965. And this patent just over time became abandoned. But it wasn't until 2003, I think, as we'll see, the inventor known as the father of the electronic cigarette, Han Lik, developed the first electronic cigarette. Now, Han Lik is a pharmacist in Beijing, China. He was 52 years old at the time, and he lost his father to lung cancer, also a heavy smoker, such as Han Lik. And Han Lik decided that he needed to quit tobacco. He was smoking a purported 3-pack per day, and he was using nicotine patches with limited success. He complained that those nicotine patches gave him nightmares all night long. Nicotine patches, really for someone who is smoking 3 packs a day, are not going to be sufficient. They need to be included with other types of medications and so forth, and certainly counseling. But Han Lik was treating himself, and he claimed that it was one of these nightmares that inspired him with the idea of the electronic cigarette when he dreamed he was drowning in a sea of a giant cloud of vapor. And he devoted an entire year to developing the electronic cigarette. And in 2003, he patented his invention. Han Lik worked for a company called Golden Dragon Holdings, and they developed the device. They changed their name later to Ruan, meaning like smoke. And in 2006, his invention became so popular that Ruan could not keep up with production or demand, despite producing 24 hours a day. And here's a timeline of e-cigarettes in the United States. And if you look at those devices on the left, they look very similar, right, to traditional tobacco cigarettes. And they were meant to. But if you look at those devices on the right-hand side, they look nothing like traditional tobacco cigarettes, and they don't want to look like traditional tobacco cigarettes. Those users want to look different. They are amongst the culture of vaping, as we'll talk about here. And many of those devices are either created by the user, or they purchase products online that they use to swap out various parts and so forth. So again, the electronic cigarette was actually invented and patented in 1963, but that patent became abandoned because there was no use for it. And in 2003, the first electronic cigarette developed by Han Lik. In April 2006, electronic cigarettes were introduced to Europe, followed by the United States. Now, what you have to realize about electronic cigarettes is that the laws that we had on the books back then to protect the public had to do with tobacco. And electronic cigarettes and the companies that were producing them very stealthily flew under the radar to try to ingratiate themselves in as many households as they possibly could while the laws did not pertain to them. All right. And so we saw, as we'll see, advertising that was completely out of bounds for tobacco cigarettes, but electronic cigarettes were able to get away with it. All right, September 2008, the World Health Organization proclaimed it did not consider the e-cigarette to be a legitimate smoking cessation aid, and it demanded marketers immediately remove from their materials any suggestions that the World Health Organization considered e-cigarettes safe and effective. October 2008, the e-cigarette developer Ruin funded a study through Health New Zealand and concluded that carcinogens and toxicants were present only below harmful levels. So they believed that that study, which was a fairly biased study, by the way, determined that the nicotine dose of an electronic cigarette to be comparable to that of a nicotine inhaler that is used for smoking cessation. And therefore, they made the flying leap assumption that electronic cigarette use was a safe alternative to smoking. And they took that and they used it in their marketing. So March 2009, the FDA added e-cigarettes to its import alert, directing the U.S. Customs to reject the entry of e-cigarettes into the U.S. Anybody know why they did that? Does anyone know why the FDA stepped up and just attempted to reject entry of e-cigarettes into the U.S.? Because we had no other way to protect the public here in the U.S. The laws here again pertained to tobacco. Electronic cigarettes had not been tested. They had not been approved or cleared by the FDA. And so the FDA, concerned about the public health, banned their entry into the US because they could state, well, you're advertising your device manufacturer as a legitimate smoking cessation aid, but you have not substantiated your claims. So therefore, we're going to reject entry into the US. In March 2009, Canada banned the sale, advertising, and importation of e-cigarettes, advising citizens not to purchase or use them, claiming they contain a known irritant, propylene glycol, followed by the FDA here in the US, notified the e-cigarette company Smoking Everywhere that its shipments were refused entry into the US. And the FDA stated electronic cigarettes appeared to be a combination drug device product that required pre-approval, registration, and listing with the FDA. And here's one of the advertisements that I spoke about earlier. This was an email that was sent out, spam mail, in 2014. You have been qualified but for a smokeless e-cig starter kit. Find out how Megan can smoke anywhere. She's sitting in an airplane. She looks happy. So this must have been the old days of flying. Underneath the no smoking sign, right? And it's a cigarette technology alert, new smoking technology featured on in these various stations here. So electronic cigarette free trial. The healthy smoker's choice, no carbon monoxide, ash, or bad smell. Can anybody tell me what is unique about this advertisement that we're looking at here? Well, smoking on an airplane is definitely unique. Yep. And what about the form of advertising? Yeah, it's another scam. Definitely. So, tobacco cigarettes. Can tobacco cigarettes or tobacco products be sent or can solicitations be sent through email to potential users, if you will, for a free tobacco cigarette trial? And the answer is no, because federal law prohibits it. But this is an example of how the electronic cigarette industry flew underneath the radar. So in 2009, the company Smoking Everywhere filed a federal complaint. It sought an injunction against the FDA because of the ban on the import of electronic cigarettes. And it stated the FDA had no authority over electronic cigarettes because, quote, they were a tobacco product. So this company said, no, we're not a medical device, we're a tobacco product. And that the FDA's attempt to regulate them infringed on Congress's intent to withhold FDA jurisdiction over tobacco products. Up until that point, the FDA had no jurisdiction over tobacco. They contended that electronic cigarettes are not drugs or drug delivery systems or drug device combinations. And then another company, May 2009, joined that complaint. All right, the first Electronic Cigarette Association was formed in May of 2009. It has since dissolved. It's a trade show. It's really a thinly veiled group of lobbyists, but it no longer exists. Okay, FDA testing in 2009. The FDA tested 2 brands, and the results found that there were trace amounts of carcinogens in some of these, TSNAs, as well as diethylene glycol, and some of the cartridges that were labeled 0 milligrams of nicotine free, were shown to contain trace amounts of nicotine. Why does this happen? Because electronic cigarette liquid at the time was really the Wild West here. There was nobody inspecting these plants wherever this was being made. Some of the e-liquid was being made in China. Some of the chemicals were being shipped from China and so forth. Nobody was inspecting this to find out what was going in this liquid. And so the public, once they had their hands on it, they could be inhaling anything. And they were. Now, in June 2009, President Obama signed into law the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act. This now gave the FDA power to regulate the tobacco industry. Now, nicotine in cigarettes as a whole could not be banned outright, but flavorings such as fruit or mint could be. And then new tobacco products seeking to enter the market were required to meet FDA pre-market standards that could affect, at that time, they thought, electronic cigarette regulation. But as we'll see, it took about another 10 years or so, maybe not quite that long, but lawsuits and appeals and so forth, as what the next few slides talk about here, trying to identify in legalese, if you will, what are these devices? Are they a drug device combination? Are they a tobacco product? Because that would change how the laws could be applied, right? So the FDA in July of 2009, after 2 months of testing, or 2 months after testing, they issued a press release discouraging the use of electronic cigarettes. They cited concerns that they may be marketed to young people, and we know federal law highly regulates the tobacco industry in terms of marketing now. When I grew up, Saturday morning cartoons, that was a big deal. Yes, I'm that old. And Fred Flintstone, halfway through the program, he is talking to every little child in the US about smoking Winston cigarettes. Tobacco industry cannot do that anymore. But we saw there was heavy marketing towards youth. FDA stated e-cigarettes lacked appropriate health warnings. We see that FDA reported e-cigarettes contain carcinogens, including diethylene glycol, an ingredient used in antifreeze. Oregon filed 2 complaints in August 2009 against national travel store chains, and they also required the companies to give the Attorney General advance notice when they intend to sell electronic cigarettes in Oregon, provide copies of all the advertising, copies of the scientific studies to substantiate any claims they were making, and NJOY, one of the companies, voluntarily stopped all sales in Oregon. That's when the Oregon AG there filed a lawsuit against the company Smoking Everywhere, stating that the Florida-based electronic cigarette company made false health claims about its nicotine delivery device and targeted children with sweet flavors, and Smoking Everywhere refused to settle. New York, Suffolk County, in August 2009, passed the first legislation banning the indoor use of electronic cigarettes in areas where tobacco smoking is also prohibited, and banned sales to minors. Now, in September of 2009, California passed a bill to ban the sale of electronic cigarettes. It made it through the House, it made it through the Senate, State House and Senate, and Governor Schwarzenegger vetoed the bill. October 2009, Amazon.com prohibited the sale of electronic tobacco products on its website, and PayPal froze accounts of domestic electronic cigarette vendors in the U.S., and all vendors outside of the U.S. were allowed to continue using PayPal for electronic cigarette sales. And that was a problem because youth, meaning young adults or teenagers, may have access to those PayPal accounts and so forth, and can purchase these products online. December 2009, New Jersey state legislators passed a bill including electronic cigarettes in the state's public smoking ban. In December 2009, NJOY announced it was going to discontinue all of its flavors except the traditional tobacco and menthol. Why? Because they were concerned about the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act that discontinued or outlawed these flavorings. All right, this is a screenshot from Facebook 2010. It's crazy, it's 13 years old. What is unusual about this event? Can anybody tell me? So this is a music concert venue, and they're promoting vaping. Anybody with any thoughts? What is unusual about this form of this advertisement, I should say? Okay, so what happens with federal law, if you notice, way back when I was a child, if I went to a football game or a basketball game, even high school, tobacco companies could sponsor those events, right? So the federal government finally stepped in and said, no, we're not going to be able to have advertising of tobacco use at sporting venues, concert venues, and so forth. So this is the RVA Vape Fest. Vaping welcome on these premises. It's a concert venue, and 5 million vapors and counting, like if you're one of them. It's really old Facebook architecture here. But what they were doing was they were selling event tickets to a vaping fest. The tobacco companies could not have had an advertisement for, let's say, Camel cigarettes right? They could not sponsor Camel cigarettes at a Lakers game, for instance, but they used to years ago. Okay, so that's the difference. Again, an example of the electronic cigarette industry flying below the radar. In June 2010, the American Medical Association House of Delegates passed a policy that urged the FDA to regulate e-cigarettes as drug delivery devices. And various military bases banned e-cigarette use in 2010. And then various lawsuits back and forth here. And I won't get into the details of this, but this went on for several years. World Vaping Day, March 2012. 2014, calls to poison centers skyrocketed because the e-juice was not childproof. So, and it would be labeled with candy, gummy bears, cotton candy, Skittles, right? It smelled sweet. It looked delicious. Little children often would get into this, gain access to these bottles. And many of these liquids contained a lethal amount of nicotine. More than half of these calls involve children under the age of 5, ingesting, inhaling, or rubbing it into their skin. And this is an example. And this is not a product aimed at adults. Let's just face it. This is not a product aimed at adults. This is a product that is aimed at children and young adults. The same playbook that Big Tobacco rolled out in the 50s and 60s. Okay, and finally in our timeline, 2014 vape was named Word of the Year by the Oxford Dictionary. Any questions about the history and timeline? Again, please go ahead and type any questions you may have in the chat area. I want to remind anybody that came on a little late, we do have a course folder. You do need to review the instructions for the CE credit, because when we're done here, we're going to be redirecting you all to complete the quiz. All right, prevalence here. We said in the 1950s, nearly half the US population smoked tobacco cigarettes. Today, an estimated 42.1 million Americans, about 20%, 1 in 5, currently smoke tobacco cigarettes. And we know that tobacco use kills more than 480,000 yearly, making it the leading cause of preventable death. And when we look at some of these statistics, now I'm a public health person, so I love data. I'm not going to hit you over the head with it tonight, though, but there are some things that you should know. About 1 in 5 US adult cigarette smokers have tried an electronic cigarette. And the concern here, and the reason is they were duped into believing it was going to help them quit. It was the healthier alternative, right? Also understand that current cigarette smokers and former smokers who quit smoking within the past year are more likely to use e-cigarettes than former smokers who quit smoking over a year ago and those who have never smoked. We're going to look at a graph here, and this was as of 2014. We're going to look at an update of that. But we see that 12.6% of adults had ever tried an e-cigarette even one time in their lifetimes. And we're going to look at sex, age, race. Men are more likely than women to have tried an e-cigarette. More than 20% of adults aged 18 to 24 have ever tried an e-cigarette. And then Alaskan Native, Native Americans, the highest prevalence, followed by non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic black, non-Hispanic Asian. So there's the breakdown for you. So again, a couple of things should stick out here for you. One, slightly more men than women. That 18 to 24-year-old age group, now this was a percentage of adults, so it did not include children. But if you're treating young adults, this should hit home for you. Hopefully you are asking your patients about their vaping use. You should know that. So, in fact, I was at my follow-up appointment today, and they are asking, have you ever used tobacco? Or Kurt, have you ever used electronic cigarettes or vaped? And then the greatest prevalence here, Alaskan Native and Native Americans, 20.2%. Okay, here's current use. This again was 2014 data. And we see again, slightly more men than women, that 18 to 24-year age group, greatest prevalence, and Alaskan Native Americans, greatest prevalence for race. Okay, current cigarette smokers and recent former smokers, those who quit with smoking within the past year, more likely to use e-cigarettes than long-term former smokers, those who quit smoking more than a year ago, as we said, in adults who've never smoked. And there's the data there for you. Current cigarette smokers who had tried to quit in the past year are more likely to use e-cigarettes than those who had not tried to quit. And among adults who had never smoked cigarettes, young adults aged 18 to 24 more likely than older adults to have tried an e-cigarette. Okay, so looking at this age breakdown, if you will, we see that 18 to 24-year-old age group, the bar's almost 10%, right? Again, these are the percentage of adults who had never smoked cigarettes and who had ever tried an e-cigarette by age. Notice as we drop down, the older one gets, the less inclined they are to have tried an e-cigarette. We also know, of course, that prevalence is increasing among children, and the use among youth doubled approximately between 2011 and 2012. By that time, an estimated 1.78 million students, grades 6 through 12, had tried the devices. We also know prevalence is increasing among adults. 21% of adults surveyed reported trying e-cigarettes. This was in 2012, up from 10% in 2010. And it's important to understand that these adults reported using e-cigarettes as cessation tools, and again, believed that these were safer alternatives to traditional cigarettes. We're going to be looking at newer data here. It's important to understand also that any nicotine exposure is deleterious to maternal and fetal health. Among middle and high school students, never smokers who had ever used e-cigarettes were nearly twice as likely to have an intention to smoke conventional cigarettes than never smokers who had not used e-cigarettes. And we said from 2011 to 2013, the numbers went from 79,000 youth, never smoking youth, who used e-cigarettes to 263,000. And of course, we know media and some level of exposure to advertising or promotions for cigarettes or other tobacco products influence these never smokers. And here's that data below. So internet, magazines, retail environments, television or movies. We know that youth are rapidly adopting e-cigarettes. We know it had a lot to do with the flavorings. There's a high level of dual use. Youth who use e-cigarettes are heavier, not lighter smokers. And those who use e-cigarettes are much less likely to have stopped smoking. Okay, we're going to talk now about anatomy of an e-cigarette. Any questions or comments here? Yes, so Brittany stated a lot of the advertising seems to be geared towards that 18 to 24 age range or younger. Most definitely. So electronic cigarettes are basically very simple devices. Metal tube, 4 parts: battery, heating coil, a chamber to hold the aerosol, and the solution cartridge. Okay, so when we look at, this is a pre-filled e-cigarette. You see the filter that contains, it's pre-filled with liquid. It is a lithium battery, and there's a smart chip controller. That smart chip controls how much voltage is going from the potentiometer in that device to the heating coil. So it controls, if you will, the amount of vapor that is produced. So here's the cartridge style versus the refillable tank style. And the cartridge style above, again, that pre-filled cartridge represents the filter. It screws onto the housing. And the refillable tank style is a little different. You'll see it has a mouthpiece, a refillable tank, so it's filled with the liquid from the bottles, an on and off switch, a lithium ion battery. Also has a potentiometer, and many of these folks will swap out these parts because they are trying to create the perfect density of vapor. It's almost like a hobby, right? So by changing the potentiometer, they can change how much current goes from the battery, the lithium battery, to the heating coil. And that's problematic, as we'll say, because it will heat this solution up at very high commercial temperatures that will actually create carcinogens. Any questions or comments? Okay. So again, it's a metal tube. Needs some way to heat up that liquid and create what is the vapor, which is really not a vapor. And this aerosol that is formed is then inhaled by the user. So Heidi said, it seems like I've heard of issues with these batteries exploding. Yes, we're at about 2 slides away from that, Heidi. So yes, there's definitely issue. So again, the voltage potentiometer here is a real concern. And the fact that these homemade devices can end up producing much more nicotine and more carcinogens. So there's some information there for you on the battery. There's been issues with them overheating, exploding after being charged inappropriately, or sometimes the user will have that disposable looking e-cigarette in their pocket and forget because it feels like a cigarette, and they pull it out, put it in their mouth, light it, and it explodes in their face. Okay, so the solution cartridge in the pre-filled contains a flavored nicotine solution to be aerosolized, and this liquid includes a vehicle solution we call vehicle, the propylene glycol, or vegetable glycerin, if you will, artificial flavorings, variable concentrations of nicotine. And although laws in the US have changed and there's supposed to be oversight, the problem here is that many people can still purchase this online. They can buy from local mom and pop shops, etc. And it's still an incredibly dangerous proposition to use electronic cigarettes. Although your patients think they may be helping their health, they aren't. And we know that the composition of e-cigarette solutions have just boomed. I mean, this is a multi-billion-dollar market. And so the flavors are really important to the user. Heidi, there's your photo. This was an e-cigarette battery that exploded in a Kentucky man's pocket and caught on their convenience store camera. So I know when I was visiting my family in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania this year for our family reunion, I come from very humble beginnings, and much of my family worked in the steel mills and so forth. And so many of them use electronic cigarettes. And what was interesting, because I was watching this, they carry the device around like a pacifier. They take maybe 1 or 2 puffs on it, and they hold it in their hand all the time. Which, when you think about tobacco cigarettes, right? When you smoke a tobacco cigarette, you're pretty much done. You're on to something else. But I think we need to take a closer look, and someday I'm sure they will, at how the use of vaping has created a different sort of aspect, that the hand has to be holding this thing. It's almost like, again, like a pacifier. You know, I would watch them, and they'd have it in their hand, and they take a couple of puffs and be on to something else in the buffet line or whatever. And I'm sitting there and I'm saying to myself, you know, this is my family. I don't get it, but it is certainly a problem. And the majority of those e-cigarette users are dual users. Okay, so electronic cigarette nomenclature here for you. E-cigarette, electronic cigarette, we know is a device, so it's known as e-cigarettes, smokeless cig-alike, vaporette, technofogger, so forth. Electronic cigarette use is called vaping or vapor. Again, we said this is really aerosol because it has a particulate phase. So it's not just a gas phase like vapor. Electronic cigarette solution, e-juice, e-liquid juice, vapor juice, smoke juice. Hot cigarette, also known as an analog cigarette, because the electronic cigarette is charged by a USB device. And mods, these are modifications that are made to the device. So to produce primarily a higher amount of aerosol with more nicotine. And this is called cloud chasing or cloud chasers. Modders are e-cigarette users who purchase their parts online. They hack their own vaping devices. And many online forums and communities detail various designs, tweaking their devices to obtain the perfect vapor density or amount of nicotine per hit. So if you go onto YouTube, you'll see many of these groups. And again, it's a cult following, right? They're in a cult. It's a hobby. And they're all trying to produce the best hit, the best vapor, the best density, and so forth. Okay, so this is the timeline that we started with. And this timeline now is going to shift to the right. We're looking primarily at these devices on the right. Those are the users that swap out the potentiometer. They do not want to mimic the look of e-cigarettes, because they want to easily demonstrate they are not truly smoking in a non-smoking area. And we know that some companies have created an identity with their devices, right? Blue, for instance, Lorillard, Walpole, Massachusetts, etc. Companies also introduce these customizable devices that allow multiple looks by using exchangeable exteriors. Okay, so e-juice liquid, there's just an array here, and you can tell how easy it would be for a child if they got into that to think they were getting candy or some sort of treat. E-liquid. There was no government oversight of e-liquid. There were nearly 500 brands and 7,700 flavors of e-cigarettes on the market, all without FDA evaluation determining what's in them. Now, the FDA, the federal law has changed, but the horse is already out of the barn, folks. It's very difficult to go back and go into some of the shops and so forth, little mom and pop shops, and inspect them. Where are they getting their e-juice? The companies have done a very good job at misleading the public in other ways. For instance, they believe that their flavoring ingredients are safe, and this is what they advertise, because they have FEMA GRAS status. FEMA GRAS is applied to food. FEMA GRAS means that something that is edible is safe to eat. In this case, my analogy would be marshmallows. Marshmallows are safe to eat. They're not good for you necessarily, but they're safe to eat. But if you put them on a stick and lit them up and inhaled it, probably it's going to be an irritant to your lungs, right? So again, it's misleading. And the studies out here, again, that were performed, we spoke of back in 2009, found that there were varying levels of toxins within e-cigarettes, even within their own brand. So let's talk now about some of those toxins. This is a photo of some of these devices that are available out there, and these are pretty amazing looking, and they're huge. Look at how much vapor is produced and held in these chambers. And you can see them driving up the road. I can in here in Phoenix, right? They're inside of their car is just filled with one big cloud, or they may have the window rolled down a little bit and that they're leaving a trail of vapor. I had some groceries delivered to my home a few days ago, and the driver dropped everything off, and I brought them inside, and it was very clear to me that he had been vaping in the car. Everything was covered with this vape oil, which was pretty disappointing. All right, so let's look at this study about formaldehyde in these products. In many samples of the vapor, if you will, the aerosol, more than 2% of the total solvent molecules converted to formaldehyde-releasing agents that reached concentrations higher than the concentrations of nicotine. And this happens because these folks that are changing out the potentiometers to create a higher temperature, for instance, are heating the delivery system, the propylene glycol and glycerol, to very high commercially, reaching very high temperatures. Okay, they're not supposed to be boiled off at that very high commercial level. And it's because the e-cigarettes operating at much higher voltage. So if we assume that inhaling formaldehyde-releasing agents carries the same risk associated with inhaling gaseous formaldehyde, then long-term vaping is associated with an incremental lifetime cancer risk of 4.2 times 10 to the 3. That risk is 5 times as high, or even 15 times greater as high as the risk associated with long-term tobacco smoking. So when you have a patient that tells you they're vaping, it's a good idea to let them know these statistics, because they do not, the patients don't understand. Again, the patients have been duped into believing they're doing the right thing for themselves. So we can't be judgmental. We have to let them know, look, we understand you're trying to stop tobacco, but here's the truth about these devices. All right, also formaldehyde releasing agents quite possibly could deposit more efficiently in the respiratory tract than gaseous formaldehyde from tobacco cigarettes, so could carry even a greater slope factor for cancer. And formaldehyde releasing agents behave in the respiratory tract. There's quite a bit of research being done now, as you know, aerosol in dentistry, for instance. The smaller these particles are, the more deeply they embed into the respiratory tract. And we know the formaldehyde is a group 1 carcinogen. Okay, government regulation here. We spoke about the passing of the Family Smoking Prevention Tobacco Control Act, considered a milestone in 2016. So nearly 10 years of lawsuits and so forth, the government finally had FDA oversight over these products. 10 years. But the concern is, do they really have control over these products? Okay, this is a state-by-state comparison. I wanted to show you where we were at in 2015. So the dark cranberry means sales banned by minors, and the light cream means there were no laws in the books. Okay, this was before the FDA had oversight. Now, if you look at a state like Nevada, of course they didn't have laws, because that's the casino industry. And the casino industry is tied to what? Alcohol and tobacco. New Mexico, casino industry. I don't know what's going on with my old home state of Pennsylvania there. All I know is that just about every relative I have has died or is dying of cancer right now related to their tobacco use. Health implications of tobacco use disorder. We know that it's the leading cause of preventable death in the US, killing nearly 500,000 every year. And COVID-19 in 2021, by the way, was the second leading cause of death in the US as of September. So heart disease was one, COVID-19 two, cancer, accidents, and so forth. Annual deaths in the US, if we added up all of the preventable deaths, they would not equate to nearly 500,000 we lose every year to tobacco use. A pandemic a year. Physiologic effects of e-cigarette use: significant increase in diastolic blood pressure, significant increase in heart rate after 5 to 10 minutes of use, significant decrease in exhaled nitric oxide, significant increase, 18% in respiratory impedance. So that is a marker of peripheral airway flow resistance. And then airway resistance, significant increase, including nicotine-free solutions. Interactome here, I want to show you this. So early on, it was very difficult to research e-cigarettes because even within the same brand, there were varying levels of various chemicals and nicotine and so forth. So you weren't comparing apples to apples. So researchers went in to these online forums to see what body systems people were reporting negatively and positively by using electronic cigarettes. And what I want you to know here is that the number one positive effect that was most frequently reported by these forum users was the respiratory system. But the number one negative effect, the oral cavity, the mouth and throat. Many reported that there seemed to be a sloughing of the enamel, bleeding gums, etc. We think of meth mouth, no big surprise there, right? This was data as of 2018 DentaQuest. Nationally, 20% of high school students reporting using e-cigarettes. This was as of 2018. That was up from 1.5% in 2011, almost 20%, or 18.5% increase, sorry. Even scarier, 5% of middle school students across the country reported using e-cigarettes. So what was originally supposed to be a substitute for adult smokers trying to quit rapidly became a serious threat among our youth. Also, exposure to e-cigarette aerosol can lead to more bacteria in the oral cavity. It can disrupt the oral biome. This is associated with tooth decay, cavities, gum disease, also dry mouth, gingival inflammation, and so forth. And the flavoring capsules in e-cigarettes can lead to cavities and increase the risk of developing chronic lung disease. Vaping and COVID-19. This was a study that was published in the Journal of Primary Care and Community Health in conjunction with the Mayo Clinic. It found that people who vaped and tested positive for COVID-19 had a higher frequency of experiencing symptoms such as headaches, muscle aches, pain, chest pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and the loss of sense of smell. All of my symptoms except the loss of sense of smell. Also, the study finds that people who vape and also smoke tobacco cigarettes and tested positive for COVID-19 complained of labored breathing, had more frequent emergency department visits than those who did not vape. And many of your patients may have turned to e-cigarettes, right, during the early days of the pandemic because they thought it would help them to quit smoking. But they actually still carried a risk factor by doing that. This was a study designed to compare the frequency of common COVID-19 symptoms, again, and between patients who vaped compared to those who didn't vape. They interviewed more than 280 COVID-positive vapers and compared them to 1,445 COVID-positive people of the same age and gender who didn't vape. And all of these common COVID symptoms were reported more frequently among those who vaped. EVALI, I want you to be aware of. This is a mimicker of COVID-19, and it is a vaping product that contains vitamin E acetate, and it's used in THC containing solutions. So EVALI was considered or declared a public health emergency in 2019. Of course, that emergency took a real big backseat to the COVID pandemic. But the respiratory symptoms included cough, shortness of breath, chest pain, fever, etc. And the cases reached a peak in the late 2019. Lately, those cases have declined because of the removal of vitamin E acetate. That was an additive found in many of the THC-containing vaping products. So as of February 2020, there have been a reported total of 2,807 hospitalizations and 68 deaths due to EVALI. And again, it can mimic COVID-19 symptoms, making that diagnosis difficult. So are e-cigarettes a healthy alternative to traditional smoking? I hope I have convinced you that is not the case. There are about 77% that are actually dual users. They're getting quite a bit of nicotine, as we'll see. And the FDA has approved 7 medications for tobacco cessation, and e-cigarettes are not included in that 7. However, the FDA permitted the marketing of e-cigarette products, specifically here marking the first authorization of its kind by the agency. And the FDA issued marketing granted orders to RJ Reynolds and a vapor company for its Views Solo Closed Ends device. Okay, you're going to see that on the quiz. Okay, health effects of nicotine. We know it increases blood pressure, cholesterol, risk for heart attack, stroke, promotes insulin resistance. Nicotine's an anti-herbivore. It's an insecticide. It's also psychoaddictive. This is the chemical that one becomes addicted to psychoaddictively. And addictive properties here, when we look at the breakdown, it's as addictive as heroin, as a mood and behavior altering agent. You can see comparisons to alcohol, barbiturates, cocaine, or morphine. And we know there are other substances, of course, in the e-cigarettes, and those have been also shown to be potentially harmful. And we spoke about the modifications of the e-cigarette. Here's one of those. This was a Tank's home style, home do-it-yourself kit. And of course, they can go in and with a little hex wrench and swap out the potentiometer and so forth. Remember that no level of nicotine is safe, certainly not for expectant women. We had a question here about nicotine as a smoker versus vaping. So if you look at one pack of traditional tobacco cigarettes, it has the equivalent milligrams of nicotine as one disposable e-cigarette. So imagine if you're a dual user, how much nicotine you're getting in a day. We also know that the adolescent brain is really frighteningly not mature, and it has tobacco use, for instance, has been associated with cognitive and behavioral impairments, effects on working memory and attention, among others. So e-cigarettes have not been proven to help people quit smoking. We again know that many of them are dual smokers. They continue to smoke, which they're conventional cigarettes as well. Cancer risk may only be modestly affected because smoking duration is more important than intensity. And we also know the concerns of formaldehyde and so forth. Secondhand vapor, yes, it does exist. So if you're in the plume and you can smell it, you're inhaling it. And we have quite a bit of information here about e-cigarettes as a delivery mode for cannabis. Now, I'm creating a course specifically on vaping and cannabis. So that would be at least an hour. I had a question about this, and it will not be during this presentation. However, I've included quite a bit of information here for you, and feel free to take a look at it. Of course, marketing and sales, we know that big tobacco has jumped into the fray. They're buying out this mom and pop shops and so forth as their downstream market and so forth. And of course, branding their own. And there's some of the data there for you. All right, and in closing here, brief tobacco dependence intervention. If you're not familiar, and you can take our quit class, this is called the 2 A's and R, Ask, Advise, Refer. And if you haven't registered with a quit line, I would urge you to do that because they're telephonic. You can refer your patients right from the chair. And they've been quite successful in helping your patients quit tobacco, electronic cigarettes, and so forth. You can go to the quit line map and look up your state or territory and register your practice. Make sure that everybody learns how to use it. They also offer classes as well, continuing education and so forth. Here in Arizona, our program actually would go to the dental practice for the training. Okay. We've got a couple questions here. If I don't get to your questions, please be sure you can send them in to me. And there is our email, support@dentalcenow. Question about from Lee Young. How does IQOS compare to e-cigarettes? So they're both vaping devices. I don't have all the detail on it, but they do market primarily to the UK. They are, no fire, no ash, etc. Same sort of marketing that we had here in the US. Do people who vape tend to use less volume nicotine as a smoker versus a tobacco smoker? No, as we saw, they probably quite possibly could be using more. The smoker who I knew that tried to quit stated they needed to do something with their hands, thus using rubber bands. Do you think that this need to do something with their hands leads to chain smoking versus holding an e-cigarette? Absolutely. And again, that is why the quit lines are so important because they have this drilled down. Okay, so having something to do with your hands. That behavior that I saw of holding the vape all the time and having to take a hit off of it or whatever and make sure it's right there, like it's tethered to you, that is psychological, and they don't realize it. You know, it's like smokers, tobacco smokers that go out to a restaurant and they have to go outside and eat, or they're on a car and they get triggered to smoke or go out to smoke. I'm sorry. They're triggered, you know, by driving in the car or being on their phone, right? So again, Natasha, that data does not include marijuana vaping, but I'm developing an entire course for it, and there's information there for you in the handout. Question about, on our health forum, what follow-up questions should we be asking when patients report vaping? It seems like many patients don't really know what's in the liquid they're putting in the cartridge, and it seems like the majority of them underreport frequency. Absolutely. Should we be asking how many cartridges they use? It was much easier to talk with patients when they reported the number of cigarettes per day. Yeah, you know, Wendy, but when you think about it, at the end of the day, we did ask them, how much have you smoked? How long have you smoked? At the end of the day, we just want to get them referred in. So if they're telling us, well, we're using 3 cartridges a day, or I'm using 1 cartridge, they may not even be able to tell you that, or they may not use a cartridge system. So the fact that they tell you that they are using the device, that gives you a window of opportunity to get them referred into the quit line. And again, get on the quit line website for your state or territory, register your practice, and they will give you all the training you need to use the quit line. All right, thank you, Alyssa. So I'm going to close out now. You're going to be sent to a screen to complete the quiz. You'll also receive an email from us with the quiz. Please be sure that you have the handout. That email will also include the handout, not just the quiz. Okay, so I'm going to close out now, and you are going to see the quiz magically appear. Let us know if you need any help. Tomorrow's the course on xylitol. And very quickly, if you haven't done so, please be sure that you register for our symposium October 20th. If you can't attend, no problem. You will have access to the recording, and that handout to do so is in your in your course folder as well. Thanks everyone for being here, and we'll see you soon.